Viking food wasn't all meat and mead. Try fermented fish, blood sausage, and cow urine on the menu. Vikings didn't gorge themselves on meat every day like some medieval carnivore convention. In fact, meat was more of a luxury item, reserved for special occasions and feasts. The average Viking's daily diet looked nothing like the Hollywood portrayal of warriors constantly munching on turkey legs and roasted pork. Instead, the typical Viking was essentially a farmer who happened to be really good with an axe. Their daily meals consisted primarily of dairy products, grains, vegetables, and whatever they could forage or fish from their harsh northern environment. This might sound disappointingly mundane, but trust me, the way they prepared and preserved these foods is where things get absolutely wild. Here's something that would shock modern nutritionists. Vikings only ate 2 meals a day, and they made it work in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The first meal, called dagmal or day meal, wasn't eaten at dawn like you might expect. Instead, Vikings would wake up, work for 1 to 2 hours doing their daily chores, and then finally sit down to eat. But here's where it gets interesting and slightly gross. Adults would typically eat leftover stew from the previous night's cauldron, which had been sitting out all night. No refrigeration, no reheating, just cold, congealed stew for breakfast. Along with this appetizing morning treat, they'd have some bread and fruit if they were lucky. The second and final meal, nattmal or night meal, was when Vikings really ate. This was typically a fish or meat stew prepared with whatever vegetables they had, paired with bread. Here's a detail that might make you appreciate your modern diet. This was it. 2 meals. No snacking, no midnight raids on the fridge. Just 2 carefully planned meals that had to sustain them through incredibly demanding physical labor. Now let's dive into the truly shocking part of the Viking diet, the foods that would make modern people run screaming from the dinner table. First up, horse meat. And before you think this was just a desperate survival measure, think again. Horse meat was actually a regular part of Viking religious ceremonies, eaten during pagan rituals. When Christianity began spreading through Viking territories, eating horse meat became such a controversial political statement that it caused actual scandals. King Haakon of Norway would literally insult his pagan subjects by refusing to eat horse meat at their feasts. Imagine a food being so politically charged that refusing to eat it could start a diplomatic incident. But horse meat was just the beginning of Viking culinary extremes. Let's talk about blood sausage. And yes, they used actual blood. The recipe is surprisingly detailed. Vikings would mix oats, barley, onions, pork fat, and seasonings with fresh pig's blood, stuff it into sausage casings, and cook it in hot water. The result? A protein-packed sausage that modern health inspectors would probably have nightmares about. And then there's rakfisk, fermented fish that makes modern cheese lovers look like amateurs. This wasn't just any fermentation process. Vikings would take freshwater trout, bury it with salt for months, and let beneficial bacteria completely transform the fish. The lactobacillus bacteria would preserve the fish by creating lactic acid, while enzymes break down proteins into amino acids. The result was a fish so potent that it's still considered one of Norway's most culturally important dishes today. Here's where Viking food culture gets truly mind-blowing. Their preservation techniques were so advanced that modern scientists are still studying them. Take peat moss preservation, for example. Vikings discovered that peat moss could keep food fresh for months, even during long sea voyages. They would bury fish in peat moss or treat it with moss extract, and it would stay fresh weeks longer than untreated fish. This wasn't just folk wisdom, it was sophisticated food science. Peat bogs are so effective at preservation that archaeologists have found 1,800-year-old butter still intact in Scottish bogs. Vikings essentially figured out natural refrigeration centuries before electricity was even a concept. But here's the kicker. They also used seaweed as both food and preservation aid. Vikings would eat fresh dulse seaweed baked into bread or dried and salted as a snack, basically ancient kelp chips. They knew that dulse was rich in vitamin C and would prevent scurvy on long voyages, making them inadvertent pioneers in understanding nutrition science. Vikings would sometimes preserve food using their own bodily waste. While this might sound revolting, it was actually based on sound scientific principles that we understand today. Now here's where the Hollywood image finally meets reality. Viking feasts were absolutely legendary, and they lived up to every bit of their reputation. These weren't just meals. They were epic social events that could last for days, featuring enough food and alcohol to make modern party planners weep with envy. During feasts, Vikings would finally break out the good stuff: massive quantities of roasted meats, exotic vegetables and fruits captured during raids, and enough alcohol to float a longship. Mead flowed like water. Ale was consumed by the barrel, and wealthy Vikings might even have imported wine from the Frankish Empire. But here's a detail that shows just how hardcore Viking feasts were. Drunkenness wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Many toasts were drunk throughout the night, and warriors would compete in trials of strength, dexterity, and endurance while completely intoxicated. Imagine trying to arm wrestle while drunk enough to see double. That was standard Viking party entertainment. The entertainment wasn't just physical either. Skalds would perform epic stories and compose poems specifically for the occasion. These weren't just random songs, they were elaborate historical narratives that could last hours, often detailing the host's greatest achievements in battle or trade. Let's dive into some specific Viking recipes that would make Gordon Ramsay question everything he knows about cooking. Starting with Viking flatbread. This wasn't your artisanal sourdough. Vikings would grind their own grain to make flour, then cook the bread over an open fire using heated stones or iron plates. The recipe was brutally simple: flour, salt, honey, and water. They'd roll it thin, cut it into rounds, and cook it for just 1 to 2 minutes on each side until golden brown. But here's the shocking part. They would pierce holes in the center and hang the bread from wooden ropes to protect it from rodents. Imagine your kitchen storage system being designed primarily to outsmart rats. Then there's the Viking stew recipe that's been reconstructed by modern food archaeologists. This dish included pork shoulder, honey, fresh blackberries, lingonberry jam, and a combination of root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and fennel. The shocking part, they would cook this massive stew for over 2 hours, adding ingredients in stages, creating complex flavors that rival modern fine dining. But perhaps the most shocking recipe is Viking mead, and it's not what you think. Vikings couldn't just pop down to the homebrew store for yeast. Instead, they had to get creative. Some strains came from wild yeasts on fruits and flowers, but here's the ingenious part. They would set juniper or birch logs out to dry and develop cracks, then put these logs into their mead to collect wild yeast. They were essentially creating natural yeast starters centuries before we understood fermentation science. Here's something that would shock modern foodies who expect strawberries year-round. Viking meals were entirely seasonal, and their survival depended on perfect timing. They couldn't just order ingredients online or pop into a supermarket. Everything had to be grown, hunted, gathered, or preserved at exactly the right time. Spring meant gathering wild greens and herbs like angelica, thyme, and juniper. Summer was for growing vegetables like peas, beans, cabbage, onions, and leeks, plus gathering berries and hazelnuts. Fall was the critical preservation season, smoking, drying, and salting meat, fermenting dairy products, and preparing for the brutal winter months ahead. Winter survival depended entirely on how well they had preserved food during the abundant months. Vikings would eat heavily salted butter, dried fish, fermented dairy products like skause, and stored grains. Here's perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. Vikings accidentally created one of the most nutritionally complete diets in human history. Modern nutritionists studying the Nordic diet, which is based on traditional Scandinavian eating patterns, have found it to be incredibly healthy, supporting weight loss and reducing inflammation. The Viking diet included omega-3 rich fish, fermented dairy products full of beneficial bacteria, fiber-rich whole grains, and antioxidant-packed berries. They were essentially eating a perfect Mediterranean-style diet centuries before nutritional science existed. But here's the kicker. They had no idea they were being healthy. They were just trying to survive in one of the harshest climates on Earth with limited resources. Their shocking preservation techniques and unusual food combinations weren't health choices. They were survival necessities that accidentally created nutritional perfection. The most shocking thing about Viking food culture might be how much it still influences us today. Scandinavian countries still eat many traditional Viking foods. Skause is now a global superfood. Fermented fish remains a delicacy, and Nordic cuisine is considered among the world's most innovative. Even more surprising is how Viking preservation techniques are being studied by modern food scientists looking for natural alternatives to chemical preservatives. Those primitive Vikings were actually pioneers in food science, developing techniques that modern technology is only now beginning to understand and replicate. So the next time you see a Hollywood Viking tearing into a massive turkey leg, remember the shocking reality. Real Vikings were sophisticated food scientists, master preservationists, and accidental nutritional pioneers who created a diet so advanced that modern science is still trying to catch up. They survived and thrived in impossible conditions, not through brute force, but but through culinary innovation that would make any modern chef jealous, even if some of their ingredients would make those same chefs run screaming from the kitchen. The truth about Viking meals isn't just shocking, it's a masterclass in resourcefulness, innovation, and the incredible things humans can accomplish when survival depends on getting creative with whatever ingredients the harsh world provides. And yet, as much as Viking culinary practices were shaped by necessity, they also revealed something deeper about their culture, a reverence for nature, community, and self-reliance that has echoed across centuries. Food wasn't just about sustenance for the Vikings, it was a means of survival, social bonding, and even spiritual expression. Their ability to harness the wild resources around them and transform them into practical, nourishing meals is a testament to their ingenuity and adaptability. Modern chefs and food historians have only recently begun to appreciate how ahead of their time the Vikings truly were. With the rising popularity of foraging, fermentation, and local sourcing in today's food world, it's clear that Viking culinary traditions were precursors to what we now call sustainable gastronomy. They didn't waste a thing. Bones were used for broth, fat was rendered for cooking, and even the humblest of ingredients were honored and preserved with care. This zero-waste approach is now heralded as a gold standard in modern kitchens, but it was standard practice in Viking households out of pure necessity. There's also something profoundly humbling in realizing how the Vikings thrived without access to spices from the East, imported produce, or artificial refrigeration. Their flavors were bold, yet simple, earthy, yet complex. They used smoke, salt, time, and patience as their seasoning. And through this, they managed to build a culinary identity that not only nourished their bodies, but defined their way of life. In a world increasingly disconnected from its food sources, the Viking way of eating serves as a reminder that the most powerful meals are often the ones rooted in nature, tradition, and resilience. Their legacy isn't just one of conquest and exploration, it's one of nourishment, survival, and unexpected culinary brilliance. So what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more such content.